Get us started. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we'll be discussing the results from our fellowship research, which began in 2019, and it's titled Climate Adaptation Planning to Support Ecosystems and People in the Gila River Watershed, Arizona. Next slide, thank you. So this picture shows our 8 cohort members, 4 of which are here today, and they're representing 7 universities in the US Southwest. We met in person at Utah State University for an intensive training in translational ecology and interdisciplinary collaboration. And then during this time, we developed our research ideas around the science theme for the 2019 to 2020 fellowship. The theme was improved understanding of the linkages between the management of headwater ecosystems and downstream water resources. Next slide, please. So after months of deliberation and many Zoom calls later, we finalized our research topic and area. In this study, we investigate the potential of climate adaptation planning as a tool to successfully address and mitigate the impacts of future climate change on both ecosystems and peoples. And we use the Gila River Basin of Arizona as a case study. Next slide, please. So to address this topic, we created 3 groups. One group reviewed existing literature to determine the extent to which stakeholder groups are considering water and ecosystem-related problems and solutions in the context of climate change. Another group used a rights stakeholder survey to summarize the priorities and values of the residents and users of the river. And the final group used spatially downscaled global circulation model outputs to create climate projections within the context of the priorities and issues revealed by the literature review and the survey. Next slide.
Awesome, thanks, Ellie. So for those of you not familiar with the Gila River, we are zoomed in here on southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. This map depicts the outlines of several subbasins of the Greater Gila River Basin. The headwaters, or the upper Gila, are outlined in green, the middle Gila in purple, and the San Pedro, which is a major tributary, is shown in yellow. And the region has a great deal of agriculture, and the Gila supplies most of this water. As such, diversions are numerous, and they help to satisfy the demand. The San Carlos Reservoir was built, which separates the upper and the middle Gila, which is circled here in a black line. In examining the climatological hydrograph at a stream gauge located just below the dam, one can see how the natural seasonality, which is shown in blue, has changed, which originally had larger flows during the winter, waning flows in spring, and rebounding flows in the summer, has been completely altered by the completion of the dam, which is shown here in red, which has really dampened out any of the natural variability within a year. Next slide, please. And finally, it's just worth visually highlighting the discrepancies between the upstream and the downstream flows on the Gila, as the full flows in the headwaters can yield nothing more than dry creek beds downstream, which is shown here in progression from A through C in the photos below. And with that, I'll pass it on to John.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike, for that nice overview. So as we discussed earlier, we explored this idea of climate adaptation planning in the Gila River through a variety of avenues, the first being a systematic literature review. So a little bit about what that is and what that means. We reviewed gray, white, and peer-reviewed literature, which essentially comprised mostly of government agency reports, municipality planning documents, and a few peer-reviewed documents and we analyze these using thematic analysis and qualitative coding, which is essentially a way to look at and quantify how often issues are and ideas are mentioned in documents. And what we did here was use issues of concern taken from the survey document to identify how often stakeholder documents mention things such as groundwater or in-stream flow, and how often solutions to these issues were mentioned in the documents as well, such as research and monitoring or planning or management. And so our results of this analysis indicate that the most salient concern of stakeholders within the basin are issues that can be broadly categorized as water quantity concerns, things such as in-stream flow and water supply. And the least mentioned concern are issues of the socio-cultural uses of the river. In conjunction with these concerns, the most commonly identified solutions were solutions that can be broadly categorized as involving water management or alteration and restoration. And the least mentioned were the identification and mention of engagement and collaboration as an explicit solution in and of itself. So a visual representation of this analysis you can see here on the right in what is known as a Sankey plot. Essentially, this is a bit of an overwhelming figure at first, but what this represents, the size of the boxes or how often those codes are mentioned in the literature, and the tendrils connecting them are how often they're mentioned in conjunction with one another. And so what you can see here is issues, concerns of water supply, things such as water supply, in-stream flow, groundwater are most often mentioned, and solutions containing management, water management, watershed management, and restoration have the fattest boxes, are the most often mentioned. And least often there is a dearth of explicit consideration of collaboration as a set solution. These boxes of engagement are very small, and the tendrils connecting the concerns to those boxes are few and also small. And now for a little bit more about our analysis, I'll turn it over to Drew.
Great, thank you, John. So following this literature review analysis, we wanted to better understand the current perceptions and the needs of the stakeholders and rights holders within this basin. Next slide. So we did that by sending out an online survey using Qualtrics to all the potential stakeholders and rights holders in this basin. So in total, we received 56 responses. So this was a response rate of 30%. And in the pie chart here on the right, we can see the breakdown, both geographic in the pie chart denoted by different colors, but then also in the breakout boxes, we see the percentage of the different professional affiliations self-reported by our survey respondents. So we had quite a wide variety, both in terms of geographic scope and also professional affiliation. Next slide, please. So here we see another Sankey plot. Here we see another Sankey plot, and thank you for John for explaining those earlier. And so this Sankey plot is showing the responses to one of our questions in our survey, and that was, what is your primary concern about the river? And so we can see here that in-stream flow was the most common, most salient response. So 35% of all respondents indicated that here. And what we see, though, larger picture highlighted in blue, is that over 70% of all of the responses here regarding primary concern dealt with different water quantity issues. And so this was a similar trend to what we saw in the literature review. And on the left side of the Sankey plot, I just want to note the geographic locations of the respondents. And we saw quite a diversity among their main concerns. So next slide, please. So now let's look at the same responses to that question, but instead of breaking it down by geographic location, let's look at professional affiliations reported by our respondents. And so the main thing to take away here is that there's a lot of diversity within these different professional groups. There's also a lot of shared concerns across these different professional groups. And so that's important from our perspective, because it illustrates that there is potential for future collaborations across these different professional affiliations. And finally, one important part of our survey was we asked these respondents about climate adaptation plans and if climate projection data would benefit them. So the vast majority of our respondents indicated here, 96%, that climate projection data would directly benefit them and their organizations and respond to their primary concerns about the river. Next slide.
Awesome, thanks, Drew. So just to touch on some of the Streamflow modeling we did, well, we can advance the slide, but maybe don't try to dig into the figure too much. I'll try to walk through some of the main highlights. So as Drew mentioned, the survey indicated that in-stream flows were of the highest priority across the users and the rights holders in the watershed. And there's a near universal desire for high fidelity, local scale climate projections. So in an effort to bring new tools to these folks to help engage in their climate adaptation planning, we evaluated projected inflows into the San Carlos Reservoir, which, if you'll remember, is at the terminus of the Upper Gila Basin. We did this across 31 GCMs in under 2 warming scenarios, RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to hit a few of the takeaway points, but I'm more than happy to talk online or offline or in the Q&A session about some of the methods or any more of the details. So this plot here shows the climatological mean total monthly stream flow for 4 different data sets. So on the y-axis, we have total monthly stream flow, and on the x, we have months starting at the beginning of the water year in October. And to get your bearings, we can see the observed record as measured by USGS stream gauges is shown here in a green dashed line. And again, that shows highest flows during January through March with waning spring flows and a small resurgence during the monsoon season. Ensemble mean values across those 31 members of the GCMs are shown for the historical period in black. So this is a historical period of the model run. It's not recreating the observed record, but it's sort of this pre-climate change scenario. So those are shown in black, and the end of century values for the climate change scenarios, RCP 4.5 and 8.5, are shown in orange and red solid lines respectively. The shading around these lines, which is also color-coded, represents the spread across these individual members of those that 31 member ensemble. So that's to help you get oriented. Here's some of the highlights. So first, there is little to no change in the mean total water year inflows into the San Carlos Reservoir. However, we do see marked seasonal changes. Second, alongside a projected increase in the mean cool season flows, the variability of these flows is projected to increase as well, with wetter wets and drier dries by the end of the century period. And lastly, the studies suggest that there's a significant decrease in springtime inflows compared to the historical period, with declines of up to 37% of historical values for March, April, and May, and up to 60% for the April and May periods, which is likely driven by the loss of the snowpack in the headwaters. And I think with that, we can move on from the modeling summary. And I will wrap up some of our main summary points from the whole project here. So as we mentioned, results from both the literature review and the stakeholder survey indicate that water quantity was a top concern among the Gila River Basin, specifically with regard to in-stream flows and water supply. And as it relates to climate change, only 37% of our survey respondents indicated that they had a climate adaptation plan in place. Although, as Drew mentioned, nearly all of our survey respondents mentioned that climate projections would directly benefit their work. In response to this regionally specific need for climate projections, this report digs into inflows into the San Carlos Reservoir and found that although the annual water that comes into the reservoir doesn't change much in the future, these strong seasonal changes have the potential to really offset the timing between when water is needed in the river and when water is flowing through the river. Next slide, please. So overall, this investigation suggests that stakeholders within the Gila River Basin are united by a concern for issues related to water quantity. However, despite common concerns, goals, and even a willingness to collaborate, collaborative efforts were present but not universally common across the basin, most notably with respect to collaborations between tribal and non-tribal communities. Next slide. So tribal communities in the basin, such as the Gila River Indian Community, or GRIC, have robust climate adaptation plans already in place, suggesting that outside organizations can benefit greatly from both GRIC's leadership and from engaging in collaborative work with the tribes. So this report strongly advocates for the collaboration between stakeholder groups, particularly with tribal nations, not just because it's morally the right thing to do, but because we can learn an incredible amount from this tribal leadership. And lastly, it is important that we remember that the benefits of restoration and adaptation do not occur in isolation along stretches of the river, but are shared by the communities and the people who are united by the river. And I think with that, that's all we have. Huge amounts of thanks to the folks listed here, the leadership team. Our advisors have been incredibly helpful and instrumental in making this program what it is, which was, I think, a huge success. So thank you, and thank you for the Southwest CAST program for providing this opportunity for us.